All right, so approximately 10% of the AP exam will be over this subject, constitutional underpinnings of United States government. These are the issues that influenced the formulation and adoption of the Constitution, the historical situation at the time of the Constitutional Convention, the Articles of Confederation had proven too weak economically, and then militarily. They were not able to, the national government was not able to defend the states. There were lots of financial problems, war debt, issues with taxation, economic problems between the states, which goes down, if you look down the list, states were locked in trade wars, which was self-defeating. Britain, France, and Spain were still there and still possibly threats to the independence of these fledgling United States. So they represented threats to American territory. Native American tribes were still there. And a lot of this was typified by Shays' Rebellion. Because of the economic difficulties, a lot of poor farmers were losing their homes. They couldn't pay their debts, and the courthouses were where the drama would unfold, where they would lose their homes. So what Shay, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, decided to do was lead a little mini rebellion, and they basically forced a court to not actually confiscate any land, and held it with arms and so on. The national government proved to be very ineffective at dealing with Shays' Rebellion. Eventually, basically, influential people had to raise some money and bring an army in. This demonstrated the weakness of the Articles of Confederation in a big way. Not only was the reason for the Shays' Rebellion the economic problems within the states, but it demonstrated the lack of ability of the national government to deal with a simple, small-scale military threat. Okay, so grasp of the ideological and philosophical traditions in which the framers drew. We need to remember English common law was the basis of American legal culture, if you will. Blackstone is a fellow who wrote down and recorded a lot of English common law and made sense of it. And these were just common law. English common law is based off what judges had decided based on earlier law and so on over time, and so a kind of a traditional legal foundation. Other issues, the emphasis in English political documents and English political thought typified by the Magna Carta, its guarantee of limited government, the idea that the king had to follow the laws as well, or as in the United States, the executive would have to follow the laws. Petition of Rights, which established the importance of parliamentary rule, the notion of a legislature being extremely important, if perhaps dominant in the political system, and the English Bill of Rights, which, among other things, all of these documents basically reinforce the earlier document, but the English Bill of Rights listed basic political rights for elites in England. So we see an evolution, a progression from early English political ideas into American political ideas. And then you take that English tradition and you add with it experience on the ground in the colonies, and then Enlightenment ideas. You mix it together and you get our political culture. Certain philosophers really pushed limited government. John Locke, Baron Montesquieu. John Locke is well known for his social contract theory in his second treatise on government, which established the argument that government should protect natural rights. If it fails to do so, the people have a right to revolt. And then we get to checks and balances and separation of powers. Baron Montesquieu lived in France. The French government, to him, seemed like it was ineffective, wasn't working. He looked across the English Channel to England, to Britain, and he saw a political system that seemed to make more sense, was better organized, was more effective. And he looked at the differences, and he argued that one of the things that made British government work so well was the separation of the executive under the monarchy and the legislative under parliament. And he argued that checks and balances and separation of powers would create the most effective, best government. This is nothing really new. I mean, Montesquieu, I'm sure, read Aristotle, and Aristotle had already argued that the best form of government would be a mix of the three categories of government. aristocracy, monarchy, and democracy. Colonial experiences. See, all these ideas are great, but if the people don't buy into them, they don't matter. But the people bought into them, the people accepted these ideas because of their own experiences. They had to essentially be independent for a great deal of things in the colonies because they had an ocean separating them from the mother countries. And the mother country wasn't that worried about them. After all, they weren't the most profitable colony. So this process of the British government keeping a hands-off approach is called salutary neglect. And then the experience of the colonies with the British attempt to end self-rule when the British government has decided it's time to treat this colony more like a real colony, and demonstrate the authority they always claimed they had. It created clashes, it created conflict, and it created a distaste in the part of colonists for strong central government. And of course, the colonial experience with the disaster of the Articles of Confederation. These are all things you throw together, and the framers, the people who actually were at the Constitutional Convention, these are the things that were going to influence their opinions about how to write a constitution. So, concerns of the framers: tyranny. They didn't want to have some sort of executive that was tyrannical and could do too much, to everyone, oppress everyone. They didn't want to have anarchy. So they decided the best compromise would be a republic. And when I say they decided, it's not like they sat up one day and said, "Oh, let's," had an epiphany. This is a process. This was assumed. By the time you get to the Constitutional Convention, of course, no one's seriously considering monarchy or democracy. The closest would be those who thought of creating a lifetime office of president or something like that. The danger of this is another concern of theirs, the danger of a national government supreme over the states. They didn't want to have too strong a central government. They wanted limited powers for government. They wanted checks and balances. What they argued over: representation, the issue of how to represent the states in a legislature. So you eventually have a compromise, the Great Compromise, Connecticut Compromise, where in the House of Representatives it's based off population. In the Senate, each state has equal representation. This is a compromise that satisfies to some extent both the small states and the large states. The Three-Fifths Compromise, one of the more bizarre issues. The South wanted to treat slaves as chattel, as property, but they also wanted to treat slaves as people for determining their voting strength. Bizarre, and demonstrates the absolute contradiction in the philosophy that people had at the time about what slavery was. Eventually, in order to have the South agree to a constitution, the compromise was the Three-Fifths Compromise. I think we are all familiar with that. Slavery. If there was no compromise on slavery, the South would not have accepted the Constitution. The legality of slavery. We have the slave trade compromise built into the Constitution. If a slave escapes to a state that does not have slavery, it is that state's responsibility to return the slave. In the runaway slaves, I hope you guys remember the slave trade compromise. For 25 years, the federal government couldn't stop the slave trade. All right, and then we go back to the issue. Three-Fifths Compromise, of course, has to do with slavery as well. There was a compromise over how to elect a president. There were lots of different opinions about how long a president should serve, how many terms a president should be able to serve, things like that. There was a compromise over voter qualifications, and in this case, they just kind of gave up on coming up with a system and decided the states would decide that issue. Taxation. There were conflicts over the power to tax. And then the protection of property was an issue. Charles Beard's economic interpretation of Constitutional Convention argues that this was the main focus of the Constitution. However, modern scholars disagree with his idea that the Constitution was basically an attempt by rich people to keep poor people from taking their property. That may have been an element in the opinions of some, but there's obvious evidence that people voted against their economic interest in the convention. So Charles Beard's not quite as popular as he was when he came up with this idea, but when he came up with this idea, this is when Karl Marx was really in vogue. So everybody was looking for some, evil capitalist hiding behind a bush. Separation of powers. The types of powers each branch has to check the other branches. You need to know that. I don't think I listed them. That's kind of up on you. Things like, what can the president do? The president can veto laws that the president doesn't like. The president can enforce laws very poorly if he doesn't like the law. Whoops, I forgot to arrest that guy. Oops. Things like that. The judicial branch, and then the executive branch has appointment powers over, primary positions in the judiciary. Judicial branch has judicial review. The legislative branch has lots of tricks. It can override a veto. It can pass new laws. It can change the jurisdiction of the courts. It can impeach and attempt to convict members of the executive or judicial branch. So the legislative branch has a lot of ways to check the other branches. It can also just decide not to spend money on certain things. It has the power of the purse. But the legislative branch, as powerful as it is, also checks itself with bicameralism. We have two houses. In order for them to get anything done, they both have to agree. And that's a powerful check on the legislature. It creates a system in which sometimes it can be very difficult to pass a law, which everybody should kind of recognize over the last few years, as we've had the legislature basically claw itself a lot and not get a whole lot done. Federalism is the division of powers between the national and state governments. It spreads out power to prevent too much of a concentration of power. It also creates kind of a situation where we have a long list of powers. We have powers defined by which part of the government gets them, and then the nature of the power. So you get into the delegated or expressed or enumerated. All of these are ways of saying the powers that are written down in the Constitution specifically that the federal government gets. And then there are the powers implied by those powers and the necessary and proper clause. And then there are the inherent powers given to government from the Constitution. So you have implied powers, delegated powers, and inherent powers. Those are all constitutional powers. I guess in a sense, inherent is kind of one of those cheats. So you kind of sit there and go, well, we just assumed everybody knew you could do that. Kind of real obvious stuff like, add territory. Now, when you get into the division of power between state and federal government, then you get into another list of adjectives for powers. You have exclusive powers that are powers only the national government can use. You have reserved powers that only the state powers can use, and you might want to look at the 10th Amendment for that. Concurrent powers are powers that both the state and national powers have. Concurrent powers, they share those powers. We could call them shared powers, but somebody thought it was important for you to learn what concurrent meant by using that instead. All right, so there you go. Remember when they clash, when there's a power that both the state and the national government have, and they both pass a law and those laws don't agree, the feds win because of the supremacy clause. Types of federalism. Land grants. That's literally when the federal government gives land to states. Revenue sharing. This is an old-style form of federalism, of grants and aid, where the federal government literally had too much money, and it gave some of its money to the states, with no strings attached or anything. That's revenue sharing. It's been a long time since it's done that. That was back in the early days of the Union, when the federal government didn't really do a lot and didn't have a lot of things to spend money on. So they would run budget surpluses sometimes, and they would just literally hand it out to the states. Dual federalism or layer cake federalism. This is the earliest form of federalism that we were under, in which the federal government had issues that it dealt with, and then the states had the issues it dealt with. They worked side by side, but separately, and had separate issues that they tended to concentrate on. But eventually we reach this point in the 20th century where we have cooperative federalism, or what's sometimes called marble cake federalism. The reason why dual federalism is layer cake is because each layer is a separate layer. They're just connected barely at one point. But with marble cake federalism, everything's mixed in. In other words, the federal government and the state governments are working on lots of the same policy issues. For example, states have control over education in their state. However, the federal government, using grants and aid, using federal grant money, has involved itself greatly in decision-making in education. And that's an example of cooperative federalism. Coercive federalism, LBJ used grants and aid more as a stick than a carrot to get what he wanted. There's also the issue of unfunded mandates. The federal government's power to make bureaucratic rules that states have to follow and not give them any money to get it done. New federalism under Nixon and Reagan, they tried to create more wiggle room for states. And one of the things they argued for was block grants instead of categorical grants. Categorical grants are grants with lots of strings attached to them and rules about how to use them and what to spend the money on. Block grants have less rules. There's a lump sum of money and it's given to spend over a particular policy area, but it is not, they don't go in anywhere near as much depth about how the money should be spent. The argument is that with a block grant, since each state's situation is different, the people on the ground will use the money more efficiently in a block grant than the federal government could with a categorical grant. Devolution. This is a trend toward more national government. The trend toward more national government power has recently started to turn. When I wrote this was true. I think it's more debatable now with 9/11 and everything that happened. It's really hard to argue that devolution is a consistent thread. It seems like in some places we're giving state governments more power, but in other places the federal government is expanding. So it's a mixed message, complicated issue. All right, so we get into theories of democratic government, and we have the classic elite theory, the idea that important leaders in government and business, military, perhaps the media, make the major decisions in the policies that we follow. Marxists argue it's the capitalists. C. Wright Mills came up with the power elite theory, where he argues that the people who really make decisions are a combination of military leaders, business leaders, and the government. Max Weber came up with the bureaucratic theory. He argued that lawmaking leads to compromises between groups, resulting in vaguely worded laws that give bureaucracy the authority to fashion policy. All right, and a great example that would support Weber's position would be the Clean Water Act and how the EPA has handled the issue of wetlands, if you go do some research on that. Next semester, when we get into public policy more thoroughly, I think you'll pick up on that. Pluralism. Power is divided. This is the theory that power is divided unequally among a large number of groups, labor, corporations, citizen groups, etc. And major issues require compromise because even though power is divided unequally, there are so many large groups that none of them get everything they want. Hyperpluralism argues that diverse groups usually fail to compromise, which creates gridlock. Or these groups get what they want, but what they want kind of contradict what other groups want, and ultimately, although they get what they want, it kind of creates bad government and a bad situation for everybody else. So hyperpluralism is basically an argument that pluralism doesn't work the way pluralists want it to work. All right, another part of the test, when you take the final and take the national exam, by that I mean next semester's final, about 15% of the test will be about political beliefs and behaviors. Just remember the stuff we're covering right now. You can imagine on the test it's going to be roughly twice that percentage, right? So on the test you're taking tomorrow, 30% roughly of the test should be political beliefs and behaviors. You know, not counting that little section that we're going to add more focus on interest groups because we didn't get to take a chapter test over it. All right, so political beliefs and behaviors. Beliefs that citizens hold about their government and its leaders. That's what we're talking about. Political socialization. is a term that signifies how beliefs are formed. Americans are generally skeptical and mistrusting of the government. It's the American norm. The exception, in the 50s and early 1960s, people had a more positive view of government. That was because, well, things were going relatively well. We had pushed our way out of the Great Depression through Keynesian policies and also through fighting a world war. We were in a dominant economic position. We were, doing the equivalent of winning football games in international politics because we were the dominant military power. Of course, our economic situation, it helps when all of your main competition have just bombed themselves for the better part of 10 years. So, a huge advantage. And so people were kind of positive. And then as time went on, people reset and went back to normal American cynicism about government. Okay, so socialization, the processes by which citizens learn about politics. Parents share their opinions. Children imitate what their parents model. They transfer or generalize the opinion from parents to other objects. Less positive towards parents and authority figures. Okay, I'm not sure what I was getting at with that. Self-image. Confident people are more likely to participate. That goes to political efficacy. Family places children in socioeconomic relationships that affect their worldview. So basically, mom and dad have a lot of influence, and mom and dad's economic position is going to have a lot of influence too. Schools promote patriotism, with, for example, the Pledge of Allegiance, conduct mock elections, teach government classes, things like that. It is less successful in teaching political participation because schools do not model democracy. More schooling means that someone is more likely to participate in politics. The media primarily influences what people think about. It sets the agenda. It's the gatekeeper. There is some evidence it can influence public opinion, but it's primarily about deciding what people are arguing over. Okay, the ways in which citizens vote and otherwise participate in political life. Factors that influence citizens to differ from one another in terms of political beliefs and behaviors. What leads citizens to differ in politics and beliefs. Your family background. Usually people, if mom and dad disagree on political ideas, usually people follow mom. Probably because as they grow up, most kids spend more time with mom than dad. Although that's changing. Education. The more education that a person has, it seems to have a liberalizing effect. Highly educated people tend to be more likely to be liberal. Socioeconomic status. The richer you are, the more conservative you're likely to be. There is something that the books talk about called the new middle class, which is more liberal than the traditional middle class. This new middle class is a group of people who often work in government and have advanced degrees, and they hang out and like to live in the city as opposed to live in the suburbs. Hit the kind of the Starbucks crowd kind of thing. Life experience. The older you get, the more likely you are to become a conservative. Peers. Peers have some influence. It's hard to measure. It really kind of depends on the person and how strong their bonds are to family and things like that. Race. Whites and Asians are more likely to be conservative, but this is more complicated because we lump all Asians together, and that's a big mistake because Asia is really big, and so lots of Asian Americans are different groups, and you'll find a lot of variety in political opinions based on which Asian cultural group you're talking about. African Americans, Jews, and Hispanics are more likely to be liberal. Regional political culture. The Northeast is more liberal. The South is more conservative. Religion. Protestants tend to be more conservative. Catholics and Jews more liberal. Okay, so some characteristics of American political culture, the things we value. We believe people have a civic duty. Now, in our country, the idea of voting has become less important. The idea of voting has become less important, but the idea of volunteering has become more important. Even though people express themselves differently, we're more likely to protest and we're more likely to volunteer. We just seem to have trouble actually showing up to vote. So that's civic duty hasn't gone away. We just express it a little differently. Equality of opportunity. We believe everybody should have an opportunity to succeed. And that's interesting because we think we do a really good job on equality of opportunity. But statistics show that we're actually less upwardly mobile than a lot of countries that we think of as being more regimented than us. In the latest studies I've seen, people have more opportunities to move up the ladder economically in France and Canada than in the United States. It blows my mind to think that we have become less upwardly mobile than France. Whoa. Preoccupation with rights. We are obsessed with our rights. And that's one of the things that even though we do have a sense of civic duty, a lot of times we forget about it because we're talking about our rights. And, we're so fascinated with our rights, we tend to not talk a whole lot about what we're supposed to do to be a good citizen. Just a little editorial on my part. Political decisions involve conflict. In some political cultures, the political decisions, the emphasis is placed on finding something everyone agrees on and cooperation, not us. For us, it's a rugby match or a football game or something like that. It's a fight. We get in the arena and we try to duke it out so that we win. And if we do negotiate, it's not from a mindset of trying to find some ultimate truth or cooperate or something like that. It's like, crud, I got to negotiate with this guy. Well, let's see what I can get out of him. That kind of a thing. Mistrust of government. If you build your government on the basis of limiting governmental power and are afraid of too strong a government and the possibility of tyranny, you're obviously building a political system that fosters a mistrust of government.